The tray in Elena Brooks's hands was shaking before she even reached the table. She had been on her feet for 11 hours straight, weaving between crowded booths, forcing a smile at customers who barked orders like she was invisible. And now, at the end of her shift, her manager had pointed to the private back room and said one word: cover. Elena did not ask questions. She could not afford to. Rent was due in 4 days, and her bank account held exactly $62. So she picked up the tray, straightened her black apron, and pushed through the heavy curtain that separated the private room from the rest of the restaurant. The air inside felt different, heavier. 5 men sat around a long table, but only one of them mattered. He sat at the head, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like it cost more than Elena made in a year, his dark eyes scanning a folder in front of him without once looking up. The other men at the table kept glancing at him the way people glance at a storm cloud, watching for the first sign of movement. Elena did not know his name yet. She only knew that the moment she stepped into that room, every guard positioned along the walls turned their heads toward her at the exact same second, like they had been trained to notice anything that moved. She swallowed hard and moved toward the table, balancing 4 glasses of red wine on her tray. Her legs were tired, her hands were tired, and the rug beneath her right foot had a small fold in it, one she never saw coming. Her ankle twisted, the tray tilted, and before she could stop it, a full glass of deep red wine flew forward and landed directly on the chest of the man at the head of the table. For 1 full second, nobody breathed. The wine spread across his white shirt like a wound, dark and wide, staining the front of his jacket. Elena stood frozen, tray shaking violently in her grip, watching red drip down onto the polished floor. The man slowly lowered the folder he had been reading. He looked down at his ruined shirt, then lifted his eyes to meet hers. His name was Dmitry Volkov, though Elena would not learn that until later. In that moment, all she knew was that every guard in the room had gone rigid, hands twitching near their jackets, waiting for a signal that had not yet come. "I am so sorry," Elena said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I am so sorry. Let me get a towel, please. I did not mean." She reached for the napkins stacked at the edge of the table, nearly knocking over a second glass in her panic. Her hands would not stop shaking. She had heard whispers about this room before, whispers from the kitchen staff who never said much beyond, "Don't go in there unless you're told to," and now she understood why. One of the men at the table, younger than the rest, started to rise from his chair, his hand moving towards something inside his jacket. Elena's stomach dropped. She thought, in that instant, that her life might actually end over a spilled glass of wine. But Dmitry raised 2 fingers, barely lifting his hand off the table, and the younger man froze mid-motion and sat back down without a word. The silence stretched. Elena stood there with a napkin clutched uselessly in her hand, waiting for whatever was coming. She had already started composing the apology she would give her manager, already imagining being escorted out of the restaurant, maybe worse. Instead, Dmitry picked up his own napkin and pressed it against his chest, unbothered, and let out a short breath that Elena realized, after a moment of disbelief, was something close to a laugh. "You have terrible timing," he said, his voice calm, almost amused, carrying a faint accent that softened the edges of his words. "Or perhaps perfect timing. I have not decided yet." Elena did not know how to respond. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. "I can pay for the dry cleaning," she finally managed. "Or the shirt. I'll pay for the shirt." "With what?" he said, not unkindly, glancing at her worn shoes and the small hole forming near the seam of her apron pocket. It was not an insult. It was simply an observation, delivered the way a man might note the weather. Elena felt her face burn, embarrassment mixing with the leftover fear still pounding through her chest. "I'll figure it out," she said, lifting her chin slightly despite the trembling in her hands. "It's still my fault." Something shifted in his expression then, something Elena could not name. He studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that made her feel like she was being read rather than seen, like he was searching for something specific and had just found a trace of it. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elena," she said. "Elena Brooks." He repeated it once, quietly, as though testing how it sounded. Elena Brooks. Then he set the ruined napkin down on the table and waved a hand toward the door, dismissing the tension that had gripped the room only moments before. "Go, before your manager notices the noise." Elena did not need to be told twice. She turned and walked out as quickly as she could without breaking into a run, her heart slamming against her ribs the entire way. She did not stop moving until she reached the small break room at the back of the restaurant, where she pressed her back against the wall and slid down until she was sitting on the cold floor, breathing hard. Her manager found her there 2 minutes later, furious, demanding to know what had happened. Elena braced herself for the worst, for the words "you're fired" to come crashing down on her. But before her manager could finish the sentence, one of Dmitri's men appeared at the doorway, tall and silent, and said only that Mr. Volkov wanted no trouble made over the incident. Elena kept her job that night, though she could not say she understood why. She did not see Dmitri again for the rest of her shift. When she finally clocked out at midnight and stepped outside into the cool night air, her legs still felt unsteady, though she could not tell if it was from exhaustion or something else entirely. The walk home took 25 minutes, past closed shops and quiet streets lit by orange street lamps. Elena replayed the moment over and over in her mind, the sound of the glass shattering, the silence that followed, the strange calm in his eyes when he looked at her, instead of the anger she expected. She told herself it did not matter. Men like that did not think twice about people like her. By morning, he would have forgotten her name entirely. She was wrong. 3 days passed. Elena worked her usual shifts, took the same bus home, counted the same crumpled bills at the end of each night, and slowly, the memory of the wine and the silence and the strange calm man began to fade into something she almost convinced herself she had imagined. Then, on a Thursday evening, as she stepped out of the restaurant after closing, she saw a black car parked directly across the street, engine running, headlights off. She slowed her pace, glancing around to see if anyone else had noticed it. The street was empty except for her. A man stepped out of the car. Elena recognized him immediately, the same guard who had watched her leave the private room days earlier. He did not approach her aggressively. He simply stood by the open door, waiting. "Mr. Volkov would like a word," he said. Elena's first instinct was to refuse, to turn and walk quickly in the opposite direction. But something about the calm, patient way the man stood there, not blocking her path, not raising his voice, made her hesitate. She thought of the $62 in her account, the rent due in 1 day, the argument she'd had with her landlord that morning. She thought, foolishly perhaps, that if trouble was coming for her, it would come whether she got in the car or not. So she walked toward it. The interior of the car smelled like leather and faint cologne. Elena sat stiffly, her hands clasped in her lap, watching the city blur past the tinted windows as the car moved through streets she did not recognize. Neither the driver nor the guard spoke to her during the ride, and the silence made her nerves worse than any conversation could have. They arrived at a building she had passed 100 times but never really noticed. A narrow brick structure tucked between a hardware store and an empty lot, its windows dark except for a single light glowing on the second floor. The guard led her through a side entrance, up a narrow staircase, and into a room that looked nothing like what she expected. Instead of the cold, sharp elegance of the private restaurant room, this space felt lived in. Bookshelves lined one wall, crowded unevenly with worn paperbacks and hardcovers, spines cracked from actual reading rather than decoration. A small desk sat near the window, cluttered with papers, and in the corner, an old record player spun quietly, filling the room with a low, warm melody. Dmitri stood near the window, his back to her, hands in his pockets, still wearing the same composed posture she remembered from days before, though he had changed out of the ruined shirt into a simple dark sweater. He did not turn around immediately. "You came," he said, more to himself than to her. "Your friend didn't really give me a choice," Elena said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. That earned a small huff of amusement from him as he finally turned to face her. "He is not my friend. He is paid to be persuasive." He gestured toward a worn armchair near the bookshelf. "Sit, please." Elena hesitated before lowering herself into the chair, perched on the edge of it, ready to stand at a moment's notice. She glanced around the room again, trying to piece together what kind of man kept an office that looked more like a quiet reading nook than anything else. "I imagine you are wondering why you are here," Dmitri said, taking a seat across from her. "The thought crossed my mind," Elena said, unable to fully hide the sharp edge in her voice, a mix of exhaustion and fear finally breaking through the careful politeness she had maintained since stepping into the car. Dmitri studied her again, with that same searching look from before. "I want to offer you a job." Elena blinked, certain she had misheard him. "A job. I own a small business," he continued. "A bookshop, with a cafe attached. It was left to me by my grandfather, years ago. I have not had the time to manage it properly, and it shows. I need someone reliable to run it. Someone honest." He paused. "You struck me as both." "You're offering me a job because I spilled wine on you," Elena said slowly, trying to make sense of the logic. "I am offering you a job because you apologized like you meant it, and then you offered to pay for something you clearly could not afford, out of nothing but principle," he said. "Most people who work for me apologize because they fear what happens if they don't. You apologized because you believed you were wrong. That is rare." Elena sat with that for a moment, unsure whether to feel flattered or unsettled. "And if I say no?" "Then you say no," Dmitri said simply, spreading his hands. "You walk out of here, and nothing changes. I am not in the business of forcing people into things they do not want." Something about the plainness of his answer, the lack of any hidden threat beneath it, loosened the knot that had been sitting in Elena's chest since she stepped into the car. She studied him carefully, searching for the catch she was certain must exist somewhere beneath the calm surface. "What's the pay?" she finally asked, hating herself slightly for how quickly practicality won out over caution. He named a number. It was more than triple what she made at the restaurant, even counting tips on her best nights. Elena's mouth went dry. "There has to be a catch," she said. "There is no catch," Dmitri said. "There is only an old bookshop, gathering dust, and a man who does not have the time to fix it himself." Elena looked around the room once more, at the worn spines of the books lining the shelves, at the record still spinning quietly in the corner, and found herself, against every warning bell sounding in her mind, genuinely curious about the man sitting across from her. He did not match the image she had built of him in the days since the spilled wine, the cold, feared figure surrounded by silent guards. Here, in this room, he seemed almost ordinary, tired in a way that had nothing to do with business, and everything to do with something deeper she could not quite name. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Take your time," Dmitri said, standing and moving toward the door to signal the meeting had ended. "The offer does not expire." The guard drove her home in silence once more, and Elena spent the rest of the night staring at her ceiling, turning the conversation over and over in her mind, weighing the risk against the very real relief of finally having enough money to breathe. She thought about the calm way he had spoken, the complete absence of pressure in his voice, and wondered whether that made her more suspicious of him or less. By morning, exhaustion and practicality had made the decision for her before she even realized it. She called the number the guard had given her, her voice steadier than she expected, and said 3 words that would change the direction of her entire life. "I'll take it." On the other end of the line, there was a brief pause, and then Dmitri's voice, quiet and satisfied. "Good. I will send a car Monday morning." Elena hung up the phone and sat in the silence of her small apartment, staring at her own reflection in the dark window, wondering exactly what kind of world she had just agreed to step into. She did not yet know his last name. She did not know what business truly funded the wealth behind his calm, composed exterior. All she knew was that the man who should have had her fired, or worse, had instead offered her something that felt, impossibly, like a second chance. She had no idea, not yet, how far that chance would eventually carry her, or how much it would cost. Monday morning arrived faster than Elena expected, and with it came a black car parked outside her apartment building exactly at 9 o'clock, precisely as promised. She had barely slept the night before, her mind circling endlessly between excitement and doubt, packing and unpacking the same small bag 3 times before finally deciding she was overthinking a simple job. The bookshop, when she saw it for the first time in daylight, looked nothing like she had imagined. Tucked on a quiet corner between a flower shop and a small bakery, it had faded green shutters and a hand-painted sign reading Volkov Books and Coffee, the paint chipped at the edges from years of neglect. Dust covered the front window display, and a few books had fallen from their stands, left untouched for what looked like months. Dmitri was waiting inside when she arrived, standing near the counter with his hands in his pockets, looking almost out of place among the towering shelves of paperbacks and the faint smell of old paper and stale coffee grounds. "It needs work," he admitted, glancing around with something close to embarrassment. "That's an understatement," Elena said before she could stop herself, then immediately winced. "Sorry, I didn't mean—" "No," Dmitri said, cutting her off with a small shake of his head. "You are right. Honesty is exactly why I hired you." He handed her a set of keys, heavier than she expected, and gestured toward the small office in the back. "It is yours now. Do with it what you think is best." For the first few weeks, Elena threw herself into the work with an intensity that surprised even her. She cleaned every shelf by hand, reorganized the sections by genre instead of the chaotic system that existed before, fixed the ancient coffee machine that had been sitting broken for who knew how long, and slowly began bringing in regular customers who had long since given up on the place. She hired 2 part-time workers, a cheerful young woman named Grace, who had a talent for latte art, and a quiet college student named Lucas, who knew more about classic literature than anyone Elena had ever met. Dmitri visited more often than Elena expected, though he always claimed it was for business reasons. He would appear in the late afternoon, order a black coffee he barely touched, and sit near the window with a book he rarely finished, watching the shop slowly come back to life around him. At first, their conversations were short, formal, limited to updates about sales and repairs. But over time, the silences between them began to feel less awkward and more comfortable, filled instead with easy conversation that had nothing to do with the business at all. "You read a lot," Elena observed one afternoon, wiping down the counter as he sat nearby with an old worn copy of a novel she recognized from her own childhood shelf. "My grandfather taught me to," Dmitri said, not looking up from the page. "He built this place with his own hands, back when this street was nothing but empty lots and one gas station. He used to say that books were the only thing in this world that never demanded anything from you except attention. And yet you left it to gather dust for years," Elena pointed out. Dmitri's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment, Elena worried she had overstepped. But he simply set the book down and looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, tired eyes carrying weight far beyond his years. "Life pulled me in a different direction," he said quietly. "This place became a reminder of the person I thought I would become, before other things decided otherwise for me." Elena did not press further, sensing the boundary in his words even though he had not stated it directly. Instead, she simply nodded and returned to her work, letting the comfortable silence settle between them once more. Weeks turned into months, and the bookshop transformed entirely under Elena's care. What had once been a forgotten, dusty corner of the city became a small but beloved gathering place, filled most afternoons with students studying at the corner tables, elderly regulars who came for their daily coffee and conversation, and young couples browsing the shelves on quiet weekend mornings. Elena found a rhythm in the work that felt different from anything she had experienced before. A sense of ownership and pride that had nothing to do with the paycheck, though the paycheck certainly helped ease the constant weight of worry that had followed her for years. Her relationship with Dmitri deepened slowly, almost without either of them noticing it happening. He began staying longer during his visits, sometimes helping her restock shelves after closing, sometimes simply talking with her about nothing important at all, the kind of conversations that filled space without needing to accomplish anything. Elena learned small things about him that did not match the reputation she had once feared, things like his love of old jazz records, his terrible handwriting, the way he always ordered the same coffee but never finished it, as though the act of holding the warm cup mattered more than actually drinking from it. She also learned, slowly and carefully, to avoid certain topics entirely. She never asked about the men who sometimes waited outside in black cars while he sat inside talking to her. She never asked about the scar along his knuckles, or the tension that occasionally crossed his face when his phone buzzed with a message he refused to read in front of her. She told herself it was not her business, that she had been given a rare kindness and did not need to understand every corner of the man who had given it to her. But curiosity, once planted, rarely stays quiet for long. One evening, closing the shop later than usual after a particularly busy day, Elena found Dmitri waiting outside on the sidewalk, his usual calm expression replaced with something tighter, more guarded. He offered to walk her home, an offer he had made several times before and one she had grown comfortable accepting, given how safe the city felt on quiet streets with him beside her. They walked in silence for several blocks before Elena finally spoke. "You seem different tonight." Dmitri did not answer immediately, his eyes fixed on the empty street ahead. "There are things happening," he said eventually, choosing his words with visible care, "that I would rather keep away from this part of my life." "The bookshop, you mean?" Elena said. "Or me?" He glanced at her then, something unreadable flickering across his face. "Both," he admitted quietly. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. "What kind of things?" "The kind I would rather not burden you with," he said, and something in his tone made it clear the conversation was closing, at least for tonight. Elena did not push further, though the unease settled into her chest and refused to fully leave for the rest of the walk home. Over the following weeks, Elena began noticing small changes she might have missed before she knew him as well as she did. The guards who occasionally appeared near the shop seemed more alert, scanning the street more carefully before allowing Dmitri to step inside. His visits became less frequent, and when he did come, he seemed distracted, his eyes drifting toward the window more often than usual, watching the street outside with a wariness that had not been there before. Grace, the young barista who had grown fond of Elena over the months, noticed it too. "You know he's not just some businessman, right?" she said one slow afternoon, wiping down the espresso machine while Elena restocked the pastry case. "I've gathered that much," Elena admitted. "My cousin used to work near one of his warehouses," Grace continued, lowering her voice even though the shop was empty. "She said people don't cross him, ever. She said the last person who tried didn't stick around long enough to regret it." Elena felt her stomach tighten at the words, though she forced her expression to remain neutral. "That doesn't sound like the man who reads poetry in the corner booth every afternoon," she said, trying to keep her tone light despite the growing knot inside her chest. "Maybe not with you," Grace said carefully. "But everyone shows a different face to different people, don't they?" Elena did not have an answer for that, and the conversation lingered in her mind long after Grace had gone home for the evening. She found herself watching Dmitri more closely during his next visit, searching for some sign of the version of him that Grace's words had described, some flicker of danger beneath the calm, familiar exterior she had grown used to. She did not find it, not that day, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew slowly in the quiet spaces between their conversations. Still, despite the unease, Elena found herself looking forward to his visits more than she wanted to admit. There was something magnetic about the contrast within him, the careful, gentle way he handled the worn pages of his books compared to the guarded tension that surrounded him the moment he stepped outside the shop's front door. She told herself repeatedly that it was foolish to grow attached to a man whose world she barely understood, a man whose past and present remained locked behind doors she had no right to open. But logic rarely wins against the quiet, persistent pull of genuine connection, and Elena was beginning to realize, with growing unease, that logic had already lost. One rainy evening, as she closed the shop alone, a man she did not recognize appeared outside the window, standing motionless beneath the awning across the street, watching the shop with an intensity that made the hair on the back of her neck rise. Elena locked the door quickly, her hands trembling slightly as she fumbled with the keys, and hurried toward the back exit instead of her usual route home. She did not mention the man to Dmitri the next day, telling herself it had likely been nothing, a stranger waiting out the rain, coincidence rather than threat. But the memory lingered, joining the growing collection of small, unsettling details that Elena had begun quietly cataloging in the back of her mind. Evidence of a world existing just beyond the edges of the one she had grown comfortable inhabiting. Despite the unease, life at the bookshop continued its steady rhythm. Elena trained a new part-time worker, a friendly older woman named Katie, who baked incredible cinnamon rolls that quickly became the shop's best seller. She expanded the reading section in the back, adding a small children's corner after noticing how many young families wandered in on weekend mornings. The shop, once forgotten and gathering dust, had become something genuinely alive, a small, warm corner of the city that Elena had built almost entirely with her own hands. And through it all, Dmitri remained a constant presence, his visits growing shorter, but never stopping entirely, his eyes always finding hers the moment he stepped through the door, regardless of how heavy his day had clearly been. Elena began to understand, slowly and reluctantly, that whatever world existed beyond the walls of the bookshop, whatever danger Grace's warning had hinted at, she was no longer simply an employee caught up in circumstances beyond her control. She had, somewhere in the quiet months of dusting shelves and pouring coffee and sharing easy conversation, begun to care for him, deeply, dangerously, and there was no simple way to undo something that had already taken root. The unease she felt was not enough to make her walk away. Not yet. But as the weeks passed and the strange, watchful figures near the shop grew slightly more frequent, Elena began to sense, with a certainty she could not quite explain, that the quiet chapter of her new life was drawing to a close, and something far more dangerous was waiting just beyond the next page. The knock on the bookshop's back door came just after closing, 3 sharp raps that made Elena freeze with a stack of books still in her arms. She was not expecting anyone. Grace and Katie had already left for the evening, and Lucas had texted earlier to say he would not be in until the weekend. Elena set the books down slowly and moved toward the door, her heart beginning to pound in a way that had become familiar over the past several weeks, ever since the strange man had stood watching the shop in the rain. She peered through the small window in the door and felt a wave of relief when she recognized the guard who often accompanied Dmitri, a tall, quiet man named Victor who had never spoken more than a few words to her in all the months she had known him. Tonight, however, his expression carried none of its usual calm. "Mr. Volkov needs you to come with me," Victor said the moment she opened the door, his voice low and urgent. "Now, please." Elena's stomach dropped. "Is he all right?" "He is fine," Victor said, though something in his tone suggested he was choosing his words carefully. "But there has been a situation. He wants to speak with you personally." Elena grabbed her coat without hesitation, locking the shop behind her with hands that trembled slightly despite her effort to appear calm. The drive to wherever they were going felt longer than usual. the city lights blurring past the windows as Victor navigated streets Elena did not recognize, eventually pulling up outside a building far removed from the quiet brick office where she had first accepted the job offer months earlier. This building was larger, more heavily guarded, with men positioned at every entrance, their eyes sweeping the street with a level of alertness that made Elena's pulse quicken even further. Victor led her quickly through a side entrance and up 2 flights of stairs into a room where Dmitri stood waiting, his usual composed posture replaced with something tighter, more guarded, though his face softened slightly the moment he saw her. "You're safe," he said, more to himself than to her, closing the distance between them in a few quick steps. "What's going on?" Elena asked, trying to keep her voice steady, despite the fear building rapidly in her chest. Victor said there was a situation. Dmitri hesitated, and in that hesitation, Elena saw something she had never seen from him before, genuine uncertainty about how much to reveal. "There is a rival organization," he said finally, choosing his words with obvious care, "that has recently taken interest in matters concerning my business. They have discovered that the bookshop matters to me, that you matter to me." Elena felt the floor shift slightly beneath her feet. "What does that mean?" she asked, though some instinctive part of her already understood the answer before he spoke it. "It means you may be in danger," Dmitri said quietly, "simply because of your connection to me." The words settled over Elena like a heavy blanket, confirming every quiet unease she had gathered over the past several weeks. Every strange watcher she had convinced herself was nothing more than coincidence. "The man outside the shop," she said slowly. "In the rain. That wasn't nothing, was it?" Dmitri's expression tightened. No, it was not. Elena sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I hoped it would not come to this," Dmitri said, kneeling slightly so he was eye level with her, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I hoped I could keep this part of my life separate from the one I have with you. I see now that hope was foolish." Elena studied his face carefully, searching for the calm, guarded businessman she had first met in the private restaurant room all those months ago. Instead, she found something rawer, more honest, a man clearly struggling with the weight of choices that had followed him long before she ever entered his world. "Tell me everything," she said quietly. "I need to understand what I've walked into." Dmitri hesitated once more, before finally nodding, sitting down across from her, with the heaviness of a man about to set down a burden he had carried alone for far too long. He explained, carefully and without excessive detail, that his family's business had existed for decades, built by his grandfather, and expanded significantly under circumstances Dmitri had inherited rather than chosen. He spoke of the careful balance required to maintain peace among the various organizations operating within the city, a balance that had recently been disrupted by a newer, more aggressive group looking to expand its territory. "They believe that targeting something I care about will force my hand," Dmitri explained. "That fear will make me weaker, more willing to concede ground I would otherwise defend." "And will it," Elena asked quietly, "make you weaker, I mean?" Dmitri met her eyes directly. "No, it makes me more dangerous, but it also means I cannot allow you to remain unprotected while this situation unfolds." Elena absorbed the words slowly, feeling the full weight of the world she had unknowingly stepped into settle around her. Part of her wanted desperately to run, to return to her small apartment and her old, simple, exhausting life at the restaurant, far away from black cars and watchful strangers, and the constant undercurrent of danger she now understood had been present from the very beginning. But another part of her, the part that had grown to genuinely care for the man sitting across from her, refused to consider walking away simply because the truth had finally revealed itself. "What happens now?" she asked. "For the time being, you will stay somewhere secure," Dmitri said. "Victor and 2 others will ensure your safety at all times. The shop will remain open, but under close watch. I will handle the situation with the other organization as quickly and quietly as possible." Elena wanted to argue, some instinctive part of her rebelling against the idea of being confined or controlled, even for her own protection. But the fear in Dimitri's eyes, carefully hidden beneath his composed exterior, convinced her more thoroughly than any argument could have. She recognized, in that moment, that this fear was not for himself. "Okay," she said quietly, "I'll do what you think is best." Dimitri's shoulders relaxed slightly at her agreement, though the tension in the room did not fully dissipate. Over the following days, Elena adjusted to a new, unfamiliar rhythm of life. She stayed in a quiet apartment across the city, accompanied everywhere by either Victor or another guard named Daniel, a younger man with an easy smile, who tried, gently and consistently, to keep her spirits from sinking too far beneath the weight of the situation. The bookshop remained open, run temporarily by Grace and Katie under close supervision, though Elena missed the familiar routine of her days there more than she expected. She spent her time reading, mostly, working through the stack of novels she had never found time for during her busy months managing the shop, and speaking with Dimitri each evening when he found time to visit, always briefly, always with visible exhaustion weighing on his features. "How much longer?" she asked one evening, curled into the corner of a small sofa while Dimitri sat across from her, rubbing his temples with obvious fatigue. "I do not know," he admitted honestly. "These situations rarely resolve quickly. Rushing tends to create more problems than it solves." Elena studied him carefully, noting the dark circles forming beneath his eyes, the tension that had settled permanently into his shoulders since the danger first became clear. "You look exhausted." "I am," he admitted simply. A rare moment of vulnerability that Elena had come to recognize only appeared when they were entirely alone. "This is not the life I imagined for myself, once, but it is the one I inherited, and I have spent most of my adult years learning to carry it without complaint." "Do you regret it?" Elena asked quietly. "The life, I mean." Dimitri considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I regret the parts that keep people I care about in danger," he said finally, his eyes meeting hers directly. "I do not regret the parts that led me to spill wine on a stranger who apologized like she meant it and offered to pay for a shirt she could not afford." Despite the weight of everything surrounding them, Elena felt a small, genuine smile tug at her lips. "That's a strange thing to be grateful for." "Perhaps," Dimitri said, the ghost of a smile finally breaking through his exhaustion. "But gratitude rarely follows logic." The days continued to pass, each one carrying its own quiet tension, punctuated by brief updates from Victor about the ongoing situation with the rival organization. Elena learned, through careful, measured conversations with Dimitri, that negotiations were underway, delicate discussions meant to resolve the conflict without further escalation, though the process moved slower than either of them would have preferred. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into her temporary relocation, Elena received unexpected news. Grace called, her voice tight with worry, explaining that a man had come into the shop that afternoon, asking pointed questions about Elena's whereabouts, questions that made both Grace and Katie deeply uncomfortable. Daniel, overhearing the conversation, immediately relayed the information to Dimitri, and within the hour, the calm, careful rhythm of the past 2 weeks shattered entirely. Dimitri arrived at the apartment later that evening, his expression harder and more guarded than Elena had seen since the very beginning of the situation. "They are getting bolder," he said without preamble, pacing the length of the small living room with barely contained tension. "Which means the situation is escalating faster than anticipated." "What does that mean for me?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "It means we need to accelerate the resolution," Dimitri said, "which carries its own risks." Elena watched him carefully, noting the way his jaw tightened with each passing thought, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as he weighed options she could not fully understand. "Whatever you decide," she said quietly, "I trust you." Dimitri stopped pacing and turned to face her fully, something shifting in his expression at her words. "You should not trust so easily," he said. "Not in this world." Maybe not, Elena agreed. But I trust you specifically. That's different. The room fell into a heavy silence, charged with everything neither of them had fully said aloud during the weeks of careful, measured conversation. Dmitri crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that Elena could see every trace of exhaustion and worry etched into his features, softened now by something gentler underneath. I never intended for you to become part of this world, he said quietly. I only wanted to give you an opportunity you deserved. I know, Elena said, but I'm here now, and running from it won't change that. Dmitri reached out slowly, his hand brushing against hers with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the danger surrounding them both. Whatever happens next, he said, I need you to trust Victor and Daniel completely. Do exactly as they say, without hesitation. Elena nodded, though the fear in her chest had not fully quieted. And you? What happens to you while all of this unfolds? I intend to end this quickly, Dmitri said, his voice hardening slightly. Before it reaches you again. Elena wanted to ask him exactly what ending it quickly meant, wanted to understand fully the danger he was walking toward on her behalf. But something in his expression told her the answer would only deepen her worry rather than ease it. Instead, she simply nodded, holding onto his hand a moment longer than necessary before he finally stepped back, preparing to leave once more into the uncertain night ahead. As the door closed behind him, Elena sat alone in the quiet apartment, staring at the space where he had been standing only moments before, and felt, with a certainty that surprised her, that whatever came next would test not only her safety, but the fragile, unexpected connection that had grown between them since the night a glass of spilled wine had first brought their two very different worlds crashing together. 3 days passed without word from Dmitri, and each hour that stretched into silence carried its own particular weight for Elena, sitting confined within the quiet apartment while Victor and Daniel maintained their careful watch outside. She spent the days pacing between the small kitchen and the living room window, watching the street below for any sign of movement, any indication that the tense standoff unfolding somewhere beyond her sight had reached some kind of conclusion. Daniel, sensing her growing restlessness, tried his best to distract her with easy conversation, sharing stories about his childhood in a small coastal town far from the city, about the sister he sent money home to every month, about the dog he hoped to adopt once his current line of work allowed for a more settled life. Elena appreciated the effort, though her mind remained anchored firmly on Dmitri, on the uncertainty of where he was and what danger he had walked into on her behalf. On the 4th evening, Victor finally brought news. Dmitri wanted to see her, at the bookshop, later that night, once the last customers had gone and the street outside had quieted. Elena felt a surge of relief mixed with fresh anxiety, uncertain what the meeting might mean, whether it signaled the resolution they had all been hoping for or something far more complicated. The bookshop looked exactly as she remembered it when Victor finally escorted her through the front door that evening, the familiar smell of old paper and fresh coffee grounds wrapping around her like a comforting embrace after weeks away. Grace and Katie had already left for the night, though the warm lighting and neatly organized shelves showed clear evidence of their careful management during Elena's absence. Dmitri stood near the window, exactly where Elena had first seen him reading all those months earlier, though his posture carried a different kind of tension tonight, something that looked almost like relief layered beneath careful control. He turned the moment the bell above the door announced her arrival, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply taking in the sight of each other after days of forced separation and uncertainty. It's over, Dmitri said finally, his voice carrying a weight Elena had not heard from him before, exhaustion mixed with something lighter underneath. Over how? Elena asked cautiously, not yet allowing herself to fully believe the danger had passed. An agreement has been reached, Dmitri explained, moving closer to where she stood near the door. Boundaries have been redrawn. The organization responsible for the threats against you has agreed to withdraw entirely from this part of the city in exchange for concessions I was willing to make. What kind of concessions? Elena asked carefully. Dmitri hesitated briefly before answering. Territory, resources. Things that matter far less to me than your safety. Elena studied his face, searching for signs of regret or resentment beneath his calm explanation, but found only quiet certainty, the look of a man who had made a difficult decision and felt no need to second-guess it. You gave up something important, she said quietly. Because of me. I gave up something replaceable, Dmitri corrected gently, to protect something that is not. The words settled over Elena with a weight she had not expected, and for a long moment, she simply stood there, absorbing the full meaning behind his choice. She had spent weeks confined and frightened, carrying the guilt of endangering the people around her simply through her connection to him, and now she understood, with sudden clarity, exactly how much he had been willing to sacrifice to end that danger as quickly as possible. "Thank you," she said softly, though the words felt insufficient against the scale of what he had done. Dmitri shook his head slightly. "You do not need to thank me for choosing you." The quiet intimacy of the moment stretched between them, filled with everything neither of them had fully voiced during the tense weeks of separation, until Elena finally closed the remaining distance and wrapped her arms around him, feeling the tension in his shoulders slowly begin to ease beneath her touch. Dmitri held her carefully, as though afraid the moment might shatter if handled too roughly, his hand resting gently against the back of her head. "I was worried," Elena admitted quietly against his shoulder. "Every day you didn't come, I imagined the worst." "I am sorry for the worry," Dmitri said. "I wanted the situation fully resolved before bringing you back into it, even briefly." They remained like that for a long moment, wrapped in the quiet warmth of the shop around them, before finally stepping back, though Dmitri kept one hand resting gently against her arm, as though reluctant to fully release the connection between them. "What happens now?" Elena asked. "Do I go back to running the shop? Back to normal?" "If that is what you want," Dmitri said carefully, "then yes, though I understand if the past few weeks have changed how you feel about remaining connected to this world." Elena considered the question seriously, thinking back over the months since she had first spilled wine across his chest in that private restaurant room, the strange, unexpected path that single accident had set into motion. She thought of the quiet mornings organizing shelves, the easy conversations shared over untouched cups of coffee, the fear and uncertainty of the past weeks, and the relief she felt now, standing in the familiar warmth of the shop she had built with her own hands. "I want to stay," she said finally, surprising herself slightly with the certainty in her own voice. "Not just at the shop, with you." Something shifted visibly in Dmitri's expression at her words, relief and something deeper mixing together as he studied her carefully, as though searching for any hesitation behind her statement. Finding none, he finally allowed himself a small, genuine smile, rare and unguarded in a way Elena had only glimpsed a handful of times since they had first met. "You understand what that means," he said carefully. "This life will never be entirely free of danger. Even with this particular threat resolved, there will always be some risk that comes with being close to me." "I understand," Elena said. "I've had weeks to think about it, locked away in that apartment with nothing but time on my hands. And every time I considered walking away, I found myself unable to actually want that outcome." Dmitri reached up, gently brushing a strand of hair away from her face, his touch lingering with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with everything Elena had once feared about the man behind the reputation. "Then we move forward together," he said quietly, carefully, but together. The weeks that followed carried a new sense of stability, though Elena remained aware, in the back of her mind, that the world Dmitri occupied would never fully allow for the simple, uncomplicated peace she had once known before the accidental spill of wine had changed everything. Security around the shop remained tighter than before, with Victor or Daniel maintaining a near-constant presence during business hours, a precaution Elena had grudgingly accepted as necessary rather than excessive. Grace and Katie welcomed her back warmly, relieved to see her safe after the tense weeks of her absence, though neither pressed for details about exactly what had happened, sensing instinctively that some things were better left unspoken. Lucas returned to his usual quiet corner table, buried in whatever dense classic novel had captured his attention that week, offering Elena a small, understanding nod that suggested he, too, understood more about the situation than he ever directly acknowledged. Dimitri's visits grew more frequent again, though something had shifted subtly in their dynamic since the resolution of the danger. He no longer maintained the same careful distance he had once kept between his two worlds, occasionally allowing Elena small glimpses into the business side of his life that he had previously kept entirely separate. He introduced her, briefly and carefully, to a handful of trusted associates, men and women, who greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and quiet respect, clearly aware of the significance behind Dimitri's decision to bring her further into his circle. One afternoon, as the two of them sat together in the quiet corner booth near the window, Elena finally found the courage to ask the question that had been lingering in the back of her mind since the resolution of the crisis. "Do you ever think about leaving this life behind, building something different?" Dimitri considered the question with the same careful thoughtfulness he applied to most things, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands before answering. "I have thought about it, more in recent months than in years prior," he admitted. "Though the transition would not be simple. There are responsibilities I cannot easily set aside, people who depend on the stability I currently provide." "But it's possible," Elena pressed gently. Someday, Dimitri agreed, meeting her eyes with a quiet sincerity that Elena had come to recognize as entirely genuine. "Perhaps sooner than I once believed, now that I have found something worth building a different future around." The words settled warmly in Elena's chest, carrying a hope she had not allowed herself to fully consider before that moment. The possibility of a future beyond the constant undercurrent of danger and careful vigilance that had defined the recent weeks of her life. She reached across the small table, resting her hand gently over his, and for a long, comfortable moment, neither of them spoke, simply enjoying the quiet promise held within the unspoken understanding between them. But peace, Elena would soon discover, rarely remained undisturbed for long in the world Dimitri inhabited, and the fragile stability they had built together was about to face its most serious test yet, one that would demand more from both of them than either had anticipated during the quiet, hopeful weeks following the resolution of their first crisis together. The trouble began on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of unremarkable afternoon that gave no warning of what was about to unfold. Elena had just finished restocking the shelf of new arrivals near the front window, humming quietly along with the record playing on the old player Dimitri had insisted on keeping, despite its frequent need for repair, when Grace burst through the front door with an expression that immediately set Elena's nerves on edge. "There's a man outside," Grace said, her voice low and urgent as she glanced back toward the street. "He's been standing there for almost 20 minutes, just watching the shop. He's not one of ours." Elena's stomach tightened instantly, old fears resurfacing with sharp clarity despite the months of relative calm that had followed the resolution of the earlier conflict. She moved carefully toward the window, positioning herself where she could see the street without being fully visible from outside, and spotted him immediately, a broad-shouldered man in a dark jacket standing near the flower shop across the street, his attention fixed unmistakably on the bookshop's entrance. She reached for her phone with trembling hands, dialing Daniel's number, who typically maintained watch during the afternoon shift. He answered on the second ring, and within minutes, both he and Victor arrived at the shop, moving with a controlled urgency that confirmed Elena's fear that this was no coincidence. "Stay inside, away from the windows," Victor instructed firmly, already scanning the street with sharp, assessing eyes. "I'm calling Mr. Volkov now." Elena retreated toward the back office as instructed, though her hands shook too badly to focus on any of the paperwork scattered across the desk. Grace and Katie huddled nearby, both clearly frightened despite their attempts to remain calm for Elena's sake. Minutes stretched painfully long before Dmitri finally arrived, moving through the front door with an intensity Elena had rarely witnessed from him before, his usual composed exterior replaced entirely by sharp, focused urgency. "He's gone," Victor reported quietly the moment Dmitri stepped inside. "Left about 10 minutes ago, headed north on foot." Dmitri's jaw tightened as he processed the information, his eyes immediately finding Elena where she stood near the back office doorway. He crossed the shop quickly, pulling her into a brief, fierce embrace, before stepping back to study her face carefully, checking for any sign of harm. "I'm fine," Elena assured him, though her voice carried a tremor she could not fully suppress. He didn't come inside, just watched from across the street. "That is often how it begins," Dmitri said grimly, turning to exchange a quiet, tense conversation with Victor that Elena could not fully follow, filled with references to names and locations that meant nothing to her, but clearly carried significant weight for the two men discussing them. Later that evening, once the shop had closed and additional security had been arranged for the following days, Dmitri finally explained the situation more fully to Elena, sitting together in the quiet office in the back of the bookshop where their unlikely partnership had first truly begun months earlier. A different organization, one that had remained quiet during the earlier conflict, had apparently taken note of the concessions Dmitri made to protect Elena, interpreting his willingness to sacrifice territory as a sign of vulnerability rather than the calculated protection it had actually represented. "They believe I can be pressured further," Dmitri explained, his expression carrying a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "That targeting you again will yield further concessions." Elena felt a familiar, unwelcome fear settle back into her chest, the same anxiety she had carried during the weeks of confinement months earlier, though this time it carried an added weight of frustration at the realization that the danger had never fully disappeared, only paused temporarily. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. "This time," Dmitri said, his voice hardening with a resolve Elena had not fully seen from him before, "we do not simply negotiate a resolution. We ensure this cannot happen again." Over the following days, the atmosphere around the bookshop shifted noticeably, security tightening further while Dmitri disappeared for long stretches. Engaged in conversations and arrangements, Elena understood only in vague, incomplete pieces. She trusted him, deeply, but the uncertainty of not fully understanding the danger surrounding her weighed heavily during the quiet hours spent confined once again to careful, watched movement between the shop and a secure apartment. The situation reached its breaking point on a cold evening nearly a week later. Elena had insisted on closing the shop herself that night, tired of feeling entirely confined despite the ongoing danger, and Daniel had reluctantly agreed to accompany her rather than forcing her into complete isolation. As she locked the front door and turned to walk toward the waiting car, a van pulled up sharply along the curb, doors sliding open before Daniel could fully react. Two men moved quickly toward her, and Elena felt raw panic surge through her chest as Daniel stepped between them, shouting something into the small device clipped to his collar while pushing Elena firmly back toward the shop entrance. The confrontation was brief but intense, Daniel managing to hold the men back just long enough for the sound of screeching tires to announce the arrival of a second car, Victor and two additional guards spilling out with practiced speed. The men retreated quickly upon seeing reinforcements arrive, disappearing back into their van and speeding away before any further confrontation could unfold, leaving Elena shaking violently against the shop's locked door, Daniel breathing heavily beside her, having sustained a split lip in the brief struggle, but otherwise unharmed. Dmitri arrived within minutes of receiving Victor's urgent call, and the moment he saw Elena standing safely, though visibly shaken, against the shop entrance, something in his expression shifted entirely, the careful control he typically maintained cracking open to reveal raw, unguarded fear, finally giving way to fierce relief. "I am ending this tonight," he said, his voice carrying a finality that left no room for argument, after ensuring Elena was safely settled and thoroughly checked for any injury. Dmitri, Elena started, though she was uncertain exactly what she intended to say, caught between fear for his safety and the raw need to see this danger finally resolved once and for all. I cannot lose you to this, Dmitri said, kneeling in front of where she sat, taking her trembling hands firmly in his own. I have spent my entire adult life navigating this world carefully, avoiding unnecessary conflict, maintaining balance. But tonight showed me clearly that careful balance is no longer enough to keep you safe. What are you going to do? Elena asked, fear tightening around her chest at the intensity in his voice. What I should have done from the beginning, Dmitri said. I am going to make it absolutely clear, without any room for misinterpretation, that threatening you carries consequences no organization will find worth risking again. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to beg him toward caution rather than the decisive, dangerous path she sensed him preparing to walk, but the fierce determination in his eyes told her clearly that his mind was already made. Instead, she simply held onto his hands tightly, silently praying that whatever he intended to do would not cost him more than either of them could bear. The following 2 days passed in tense, uncertain silence, Elena confined once again to careful watch, while Dmitri remained largely absent, engaged in matters she understood only through Victor's brief, guarded updates. On the third evening, Dmitri finally returned to the secure apartment where Elena had been staying, his expression carrying a heavy exhaustion mixed with unmistakable relief. It's finished, he said simply, settling onto the sofa beside her. Completely, this time. There will be no further attempts. Elena studied his face carefully, noting new lines of fatigue that had not been there a week earlier, though beneath the exhaustion, she saw genuine peace settling into his features for the first time since the danger had first resurfaced. What did it cost you? She asked quietly, bracing herself for whatever answer he might give. Less than you might imagine, Dmitri said, and more than I once would have been willing to pay. Before you. But it is done, and you are safe. That is what matters most to me. Elena leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, feeling the tension of the past week finally begin to ease from her body. I don't want to keep living like this, she admitted quietly, always watching, always waiting for the next threat. I know, Dmitri said, wrapping an arm gently around her. And I promised myself, watching those men approach you outside the shop, that I would finally take real steps toward the different future we spoke of months ago. I have already begun transferring certain responsibilities to trusted associates. It will not happen overnight, but it has begun. Elena lifted her head to study his face, searching for any hesitation behind his words and finding none. You're serious? Completely, Dmitri said. I want a life with you that does not require constant vigilance, constant fear. I want mornings at the bookshop that are simply mornings, evenings together that carry no hidden danger beneath them. It will take time, but I intend to build that future, carefully and deliberately, starting now. Tears gathered unexpectedly in Elena's eyes, relief and hope mixing together after weeks of fear and uncertainty. I'd like that, she whispered. More than anything. In the months that followed, the bookshop returned to its familiar, comfortable rhythm, though this time the peace felt more permanent, more deeply rooted than the fragile calm that had existed before. Dmitri gradually stepped back from the more dangerous aspects of his inherited responsibilities, transferring authority carefully to trusted hands, while focusing increasingly on legitimate ventures, the bookshop becoming the first of several small businesses he began building openly, without the shadow of his family's darker legacy hanging over each decision. Elena continued running the shop with the same dedication that had first caught Dmitri's attention months earlier, though now she did so without the constant undercurrent of fear that had once accompanied even the simplest tasks. Grace and Katie remained fixtures of the daily routine, and Lucas eventually took a part-time role helping Elena expand the shop's small but growing collection of rare and classic titles, the space slowly becoming exactly the vibrant, welcoming corner of the city that Dmitri's grandfather had originally envisioned decades earlier. On a quiet evening nearly a year after that first accidental spill of wine had changed the direction of both their lives entirely, Dmitri closed the shop early, ushering out the last few customers with an unusual gentleness before turning the sign on the door to closed. Elena watched him curiously as he moved through the familiar space, his expression carrying a nervous energy she had rarely witnessed from him before. "Everything all right?" she asked, setting down the stack of books she had been organizing. Dmitri crossed the shop slowly, stopping in front of her with a small, worn box held carefully in his hands. "I wanted to ask you something," he said, his voice carrying a vulnerability entirely unlike the calm, controlled man she had first encountered in that private restaurant room, somewhere that felt right. And nowhere feels more right than here. Elena's breath caught as understanding dawned slowly across her features, watching him lower himself carefully in front of her, the worn box opening to reveal a simple, elegant ring that caught the warm evening light filtering through the shop's front window. "You spilled wine on me the night we met," Dmitri said, a genuine smile breaking through his nervous expression, "and somehow, impossibly, gave me back a life I did not know I was missing. I would like to spend the rest of my life finding out what else you might accidentally give me, if you'll have me." Elena laughed through unexpected tears, nodding before she could even find the words to answer properly, pulling him up into a fierce embrace that carried within it every quiet moment, every fear overcome, and every hope carefully built between them since that first, unforgettable night. Outside, the city moved on unaware, but inside the small, warmly lit bookshop that had once gathered dust and now overflowed with life, two people who had found each other through the most unlikely of accidents finally allowed themselves to fully imagine the future waiting ahead of them, together, safe, and entirely their own.